This video is brought to you by BTI Institute, a New Jersey leader in certification-based management training.
Good evening, folks in New Jersey, and hello, Greta in California, amongst other places. We are very happy and excited to have Greta back. For those of us who missed the 40th annual PMI New Jersey Symposium, Greta was there. And Bob Phillips was very kind enough and lucky to just say, hey, Greta, would you like to come back in a virtual event? And she's just been great. In today's topic, we're talking about AI. It's ever evolving. I could start talking about, what this is going to be about, but by the end of it, it's going to change already, right? That's the speed of AI that's happening. So Greta's going to get us a few things that are going to rewire our brain. She is an accomplished author, a business consultant, a speaker, amongst other things. And Greta, let me just hand you over presentation. And thank you again for doing this for us.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'll share my screen so that everybody can see it. Hopefully, as you can see it now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So you'll notice on here, I've made a slight change because instead of calling it artificial intelligence, I really prefer to call it augmented intelligence because there is no way, at least now, and I don't think for a long time, that we're going to have machines and software and everything completely replace what we as human beings can do. Now, we can use technology, and we have for years. I mean, I go back in technology more years than I want to admit to, and I've seen how it's changed. And so moving it from traditional waterfall into any sort of agile, I looked at it and said, I've been doing this all along. I just didn't know that's what it was called. And when we move into AI, because of my data background, it's like, oh, we're just taking and doing more than we could before. So looking at it from that standpoint, it still requires human beings, whether we're doing agile, whether we're doing waterfall, whatever we're doing. And it's not just a single individual a lot of times, it's multiple folks that we're going to need. Now, I actually have a few certifications here that I put up. These are my Agile and artificial intelligence certifications. I also have a whole bunch of other ones too, partly because I'm an authorized training partner for PMI. So I can teach all of the authorized courses, the certification courses. But the other thing is, looking at any one of these single certifications is like looking at a silo, as opposed to saying, so how does that interact with other things? And when PMI came up with this CPMAI, it was like, good. It's not just ChatGPT asking, how can you answer this question? Or how do I get from point A to point B? That's fine. But cognitive AI goes into a lot more from a business organization standpoint because it's really looking at the predictive and decision making that we do. We do it currently with business intelligence, data warehouse, things like that, but we're limited by the amount of data we have, frequency of that data, etc. This pops it to a whole nother level and allows us to do a lot more decision making with more frequent data, more recent data, and just the fact that we have more to make decisions off of. Yes, that does make a problem for us, though, as we move through. So when we talk about both Agile and AI, they have both evolved from areas where we had some kind of obstacles, as we call them in Agile, that we needed to figure out how to overcome. Now, as human beings, you put a problem in front of us, we're going to try to solve it. And sometimes we solve it with technology, and sometimes we solve it by just our own human being and our interactions from people to people. But that's how we've really had a chance to evolve this delivery that's supported by some sort of technology. Now, one of the things that we do, if we go back and look at AI and then think about how Agile works, we can make it more practical. Okay, yes, I know we have robots that can go, figure out how to put a mouse through a maze. We know how we can, put those self-driving cars together. But how practical is that for a whole lot of people? And how much can it change? We hear all the things that happen with these self-driving cars, and yet they can only go where we've taught them to go. They come into a situation we haven't taught them, and they're stuck, maybe in the middle of the street, or maybe going around and around and around in some sort of roundabout. The key I look at is what this really allowed us to do was take a portion of the 7 different patterns of AI that are more focused towards a business. And that's where I want to kind of make sure that we understand how important and how productive AI can be when we move into that aspect. When we talk about AI in general, uncertainty. Well, wasn't that what Agile had? Yes. What about the data? Interesting. We didn't really talk about data when we got into Agile, except maybe when we started looking at personas and we said, well, maybe there's different data that's needed depending on who that persona for that user story is. But it never really looked at trying to help us do any sort of probability. And that's where we see today that sometimes those decisions have to be made on the spur of the moment. But the thing is, it changes all the time. The data changes, the model changes, the rule changes, the environment changes. And as a result, we have to be able to adapt to those changes 100 times more than we kind of thought about, well, we'll have changing conditions for Agile. We can't do this linear. There's not steps anymore. AI doesn't work in processes. It works in data, decisions. And as a result, we need to be able to take the concepts we've used within Agile and help apply them to put a little bit of structure and understanding as to how we can do what we need to do within the AI world. So, we started out years ago with these fixed requirements, which meant we had understood what we needed to do because we had done it before. We're into things now we have never done before. So as a result, we have to be able to figure out how to work with those. Now, a lot of times the initiatives that people come up with, in fact, I had a meeting this morning with somebody and she said, Greta, how do I explain to my executives that AI is not going to solve every problem there is? Does that sound like what happened years ago when executives said all of our projects are going to be Agile going forward? We're going to think Agile can solve everything. I'm sorry, you can't build a house using Agile. You can't build a house using AI. You can get some probabilistic, that's a hard word to say, probabilistic area of, well, what's the probability of my material for the roofing arriving in time based on data I give it, etc. I can use that, but it's not going to tell me how to build a house. It might try. And some people have tried to do that, and they're very surprised in what it comes up with. But the big key, and I think this is the big change that I saw, is that rather than individuals, especially executives, thinking that whatever we do is going to solve a problem completely, it's realizing there's uncertainties. And they're normal. They're not that one-off. It's not that black swan. It's not, oh, we may have an uncertainty here or there. No, that's the world we live in. And just because we have an uncertainty doesn't mean it's a failure. It means, oh, there's something else we need to consider. And I go back, we're talking about Edison, we're talking about experimentations. How many times did that fail before he actually was able to come up with a working model? But he didn't stop. It wasn't a failure. It was, oh, won't try that again. Let me go try something else. And that's that whole idea here. So it also starts to shift the whole idea from being a technical resource where whatever we do technically at the outcome is going to be the success factor we're looking for, and realizing that success comes from whether you can use it to make decisions, whether it improves efficiency, whether you can actually do better as far as your service delivery, and it provides outcomes that provide value. I'm looking at the new PMP. I'm having to start to teach for the new exam coming out in July. Do you realize that there were 9 slides in the original PMP deck I got from PMI just on vision and 12 on value? And that's the whole key. What we do, where are we trying to go, what kind of outcome, and what value is it going to produce? This is where we start seeing that we tie what we're trying to do to the value we're trying to create. And in CPMAI, that is phase 1. What is the value you're trying to do? And is AI even the right choice to use to be able to deliver that value? We also talk about outcomes and requirements to be able to get those outcomes, not outputs. And that's another word that's been changed in our vocabulary, that rather than looking at those requirements as this is what I have to create, this is the outcome I have to provide by doing that. And rather than having just a single way to do that, we have the ability to try different options. And that flexibility is what we're going to need to use. And that flexibility is not just that one time through. That flexibility is going to have to be continually, because the data is going to change, the environment's going to change, and we're going to have to continue to be flexible to meet that changing environment. Now, what I see from the standpoint of uncertainty in AI, the biggest uncertainty comes not from who the stakeholders are or what they want to do, but where are we going to get the data? Is it going to be sufficient? Is it going to be good? Am I going to get conflicting data? And what am I going to do about that? What I have to look at is, once again, taking short cycles, just like we do in Agile, taking a few things, testing it, seeing what the result is, and then going back and maybe tweaking it a little bit, or maybe just adding more data in order to get us where we need to be. But this whole idea that it doesn't have to be perfect, in fact, it never, I hate to say, is going to be perfect, because the data that we're getting is going to change. A good example, because I have a client I work with in, I guess it's in Delaware. It's right there between Delaware and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, that area, which, I keep crossing state lines when I'm back there, but he's in the oil and gas industry. He does distribution. And he was saying about how the fact that he's always had to kind of forecast usage. And now he can get the data, but, a whole bunch of readings every second or even less than that to make decisions. So he doesn't have to look at, well, last month, the energy increased by 20%. Therefore, I should either plan more or realize that was an off or whatever. He said, yes, I'm getting it all the time, But the whole thing is now I have to figure out, what am I going to do with all this data? How am I going to be able to combine it and trend it and use it the right way? But I have to figure out, where's it coming from, and all those things that come along with that additional data that you have. The other thing, as I said, that really made this kind of a little different, especially in the data world, estimating. Well, we used to talk about analogous estimating, parametric estimating, 3-point estimating. How about if we use 1,000-point estimating? How about if we use more like a, Monte Carlo, where we estimate using 1,000 pulls or 1,000 tries? The velocity of that data coming in, it doesn't come, we don't batch it and then try and take a batch and work with it anymore. It reminds me more of the continuous flow type of Agile process. Because in TimeBox, Scrum, we get all these requests, but then we batch them together and we work one batch at a time over that time period. Whereas with continuous flow, a help desk, you're getting requests in all the time, and the first thing you prioritize them and decide what you're going to do with them. And that's what we're talking about here. But we're not talking about maybe one request an hour, even one request a minute. We're talking thousands of pieces of data coming in a second. And how we're going to be able to work with that. Well, that's what technology is for. If we know what it is and how it has to be massaged or combined, we can let some sort of computer do that work for us. Actually, we can't predict what's happening. We can't predict what we're going to get. We can't predict how things might change, but we have to be aware of it. And so a lot of times this exploratory life cycle that we talk about in Discipline Agile is probably a better kind of mapping if I really look at mapping it directly back to AI, in the fact that I try something, I look at the result. If that makes sense, maybe part of it does, maybe part of it doesn't. The retrospective, the demonstrations at the end of that iteration to give us that feedback as to where we're going to go. Now, it's interesting because CPMI, one of the main things it says, plan large, but execute iteratively. So it's even saying, kind of have that vision of where you want to go, what value you're trying to get, but don't try to get there in one step. In other words, take small chunks and work through it. Small use cases, limited data sets, basic models, and then we can always build on them. I would love to see the AI going on behind Amazon today as Prime Day. Because the data that's coming in right now, if you don't think they're looking at that and analyzing that, oh, absolutely. They're doing comparisons between what it was last year. They're looking at certain products. Now, they did a lot of that ahead of time to determine what they were going to put out there for Prime Day. But I wonder, do they take some things and replace them with other items because maybe that item is selling out and therefore they're going to take it off? I mean, you never see on Prime Day where it says that product sold out. That's because they're monitoring it. They're using all that data. But the idea is every year that they do this, they get better and better. And you notice now they don't just do Prime Day once a year. They do it multiple times a year. So they're doing it even more often. But they start small and they just start adding to it. Kind of interesting when you see the fact that Walmart and Target are doing the same kind of prime days right now, or prime weeks, or prime months, whatever, over a period of time, based on the fact that they're seeing what the competitor does. Can they actually see the competitor's data? In most cases, now they can. And I think that's one of the things that you're looking at, and maybe not exactly the data, but there's an awful lot you can see. But that experimentation, and in AI, the experimentation comes in 3 different areas. One, in just what data do I need? Where's it going to come from? What format does it have to be in? Some of your data may be in year, month, day, some may be in month, day, year, different formats. We need to know that. And in this next step, we're going to get it all cleaned up. That what we always talked about is ETL, extract, transform, and load. Now we're really doing an extract load, but we're not transforming very much until we figure out what we need, because maybe we don't know that 90% of our data is going to come in one format rather than another. The algorithms, how we're going to look at that, has to change all the time. And it may just be an algorithm of looking just basically behind like a chat bot, where you have, you go into text and chat with somebody about your credit card or your airplane flight or your airline flight or whatever. And it gives you 4 options. Which one would you get? They're keeping data behind it to figure out how often does that user actually find in that what they're looking at? Or when do they have to hit other? Or how long do they have to sit there trying to figure? They do the same thing if you're on an IVR on the phone and you're trying to go through, okay, there's 5 different options. Can you say that again? That's an indication, and that's data that's being used to go back and kind of look at the algorithm that's being used to make decisions. But those algorithms that are taking that data and making a decision, either what to do, where to send it, what to do about it, it's constantly got to be tuned. And the problem that happens is, this is where we get into that human in the loop. If you go in and apply for a credit card and you fill out all of this and you get rejected, you have the right to go back and ask why. Now, first of all, if they did not notify you and tell you that the decision was being made by AI, they're in trouble now, because they have to disclose that decisions are being made through AI, not by a human. So what's happening now is you're seeing fewer and fewer rejections, especially because the rejection doesn't say you're being rejected. It's being transferred to somebody to look at it further, meaning it's gone through a certain level, but that final decision has to go back to a human being. And that's where otherwise we get those false positives or false negatives that are happening, which could be really disastrous in certain instances. The tuning itself, this is not a one-time. First of all, you take data that you think is typical. Sometimes we have to augment it to have more options, etc. We use it to train the model to say, when this comes in, this is what you should do. This comes in, this is what you should do. When we start to make it and put it in live, we may have different type of data. And either the model doesn't know what to do with it, or it makes a decision that's incorrect and we have to go back and tune it. That model, because the data drifts, that's a term we use, the model has to change too. If I look at sales, go back to Amazon Prime Day right now, I look at sales maybe 2 months ago as opposed to now. It's going to be very different because the sheer volume and the fact that they've worked on that. I was just watching a presentation this morning to go along with one that I'm doing on telling stories with data. How do you take the data and visualize it and put it into a graph form or whatever? And the thing is that if you look at data at different points in time, it's not just, well, these are the sales, but if I don't realize that that was Amazon Prime Day or Black Friday or whatever, it's going to have an impact on what you're doing. And that's part of the tuning that has to be done. We did in Agile set this up so that we do things in small chunks. We do something, we demonstrate it. Hopefully we get feedback before we get to that demonstration point, but we have short cycles. And then the retrospective allows us to go back and really understand what happened during that time period. The longer that cycle is, the less you remember about what started and where the initial problem may have started to come up. But getting used to doing things in smaller chunks. And I think as we start to make this kind of the way we do things, I know for a fact this is what's being taught to my grandkids. They are being taught to look at things in chunks of time. They're given a task to do, they're given pieces of it, rather than saying, okay, here's the whole thing, good luck. Trying to figure out how to kind of chunk it into different pieces. But every time we go through one of these things, that demonstration in Agile is the same as when we test the result of that data going through the model. We are the ones that are really the users, the reviewers. We are the stakeholders or product owner who's looking at, this is what we think was going to happen. This is what we kind of taught the model to do. Is that's what really happening? So building this, not just in iterations, but also building it in smaller releases. We don't have to do everything. We can do a piece at a time as we work through. Those increments, being able to release back to the customer. If you actually use the chat process very often with either a credit card company or an airline, you'll see that about every month, probably, they add some stuff to it because they have basically a month-long release where they've added more functionality. So taking that and saying, okay, well, I'm going to try a prototype and I'm going to only provide it back to the people who've worked on it so we get a feeling before we put it out to the world. And then maybe we pilot with just a small group. I will bet if the airline puts one of these in, they do not provide it to their executive flyers first. Because boy, it's probably the best testers, but let's try it on a more simpler, smaller amount of data, maybe not as intense. And then as you continue to add more and more, you start to see. One of the things that one of the airlines that I fly on has done, which I hope the rest pick up on, and I don't know because most of the time I fly on 2 airlines, but you know how when you used to want to go in and change a flight, you had to go and call and talk to somebody, tell them what you wanted, and then they had to go transfer to somebody to say, well, let me go figure out what it's going to cost and come back and say, okay, this is what it's going to cost. Well, how about if I go to this one instead? Back over to get how much it's going to cost and back. The one airline I was looking at the other day, my flight, would you like to change this? Click on the button. Put in what date, maybe the location, maybe you have to change it, the location, maybe whatever. And it basically pulls up like it's a brand new flight. You know when it goes. You also know what the difference in cost is. So it knows what you paid for the ticket you hold, and it looks at what you paid versus what the new cost is, and it tells you. And there are times when I've actually had it say, you're going to get a refund back because the new flight is less than what you paid for initially. Wow. Is that not AI? It's probably Agile that did that, but could it have been that that was because there was some kind of looking at where do we waste a lot of time, especially with a customer having to be on hold while we're trying to figure out if they can change a flight and how much it's going to cost. Customer service. I'm not saying that AI was the one that made that happen. I'm sure it was an agile kind of approach, but the idea was testing it out, but bringing that business value. So looking at this idea of how can I get small wins? And this is agile. We've always talked about how can we chunk it and provide more value more frequently. We don't have to provide everything. We provide a little bit. Now, would it be nice if that, use more that Kano model where you look at the customer and think what the customer's going to think is the biggest win? Yeah. And that's why we teach people in software about a marketing type of tool called a Kano model. It's purely saying what features and functions would make that customer so excited that they would buy that new product, that they would refer that to other people. Do you think I haven't referred that one airline and what they do to other people to say, hey, if there's a question of your flights, etc., why don't you seriously look at this airline? Because it's going to be so much easier. Customer service. So rather than trying to do everything, very large aspects, we really look at making it smaller and smaller. When I'm teaching, I look out my backyard, and we have 400 homes now that are built on what used to be a golf course. This, unfortunately, is pretty common out here now. But 400 homes, they didn't build all 400 homes. Building a home is predictive, yes. Building 400 homes, though, if we actually use predictive, they would have built all 400 before anybody could move in. And what did they do? They put them into subdivisions. And they would do a subdivision and they would release it. That's where we're starting to see what we talk about in Agile and even in AI, in doing different iterations and pieces of this. We see it in everything we do. Those of you that are really into Agile, I'm going to ask you to consider picking up a book that's called The 12-Week Year. Very interesting. It is talking about when you're going to do strategic planning or any sort of planning, rather than trying to plan the entire year, plan it in 12-week increments. And you know what? If you read between the lines, everything they're doing in there is an agile concept. They don't call it retrospectives. They don't call it iterations. They don't call our term. But this is business people being addressed and applying what we're doing conceptually to strategic planning. Very interesting. When I first was, told about this book, I went and got it, and I'm going, wow, this is almost like when I saw things, like the 5 Whys show up as a commercial on TV, where they don't say that's what it is, but that's what they're using to sell their internet product. But this is where I start looking at these smaller wins prioritizing, just like we do in Agile, what is the most important? Where are we going to get those small wins from there? Stakeholders. Being able to have those stakeholders understand what we're doing. Now, what's interesting is we may not in AI have the stakeholders as involved as even we do in Agile, which, we say we have to have them involved full time, which we know we can't have. But the thing is, we can still have that explanation, that transparency, understanding what's going on, and that trust, those demonstrations, being able to check things, making sure that it's working. And we have different points of view. Once again, different perspectives, looking at the results that are coming out of these type of things. This building trust in what we're doing. And that's one of those areas that I personally, I still don't trust those Waymo cars. I'm sorry. Being in Southern California, I don't know if people who know how to drive can actually drive, much less having trying to teach a car. My grandson is getting his license in a few months. And I keep telling him, there are more exceptions than there are rules when you're driving. And you don't have to just worry about staying in your lane. You need to worry about the cars on both sides, the car behind you, the car in front of you, and the car in front of that one, because you have to know what's going on in all of those aspects. And that's where, when we start to look at this, unless we get multiple perspectives, we're not going to be able to include all of those things together as we go through. Now, when we talk about the teamwork, this is a little interesting, because when I talk about teams using more of a predictive approach, we talk about how the project manager plans what needs to be done based on the requirements, and they put together a schedule and then determine what resources are needed at what time to do the work. But in Agile, we put a team together. And there's an assumption that whatever needs to be done on that project, those team members have the skills to do it. Because according to Scrum, it's full-time team. You don't add people, you don't take people out. That generalizing specialist, they're going to be able to do things. I can't tell you the amount of money that I have made over the years from a Scrum team who tried to redesign or add something to a database and totally mess it up. And I had to come in and undo it and redo it to make it work, because those people didn't understand kind of the nuances of doing that. When we start looking at AI, we're going to start talking about a lot of additional people, a lot of additional skills, competencies, resources, terminology. I started out as a systems analyst because I was kind of the analyst on the IT type of projects within the insurance company where I kind of started. And then I became more of a data analyst when I started doing databases and data discovery and all the stuff that had to be done to build a data warehouse. And then we changed the name from just storing data in a data warehouse to try to provide it back out through business intelligence. Now my title became a business analyst, because I have to understand what the business wants, and therefore how do we make sure the data provides for them. The terminology today, I just found out about a year or so ago, I'm now a data engineer. No, I'm a data scientist, sorry. I'm a data scientist first. A data scientist who basically discovers what kind of data we need, where it is, who has permission, how we have to play with it. But then once we start to manipulate it, now I'm a data scientist. I've gone from a data scientist to a data engineer, and then they really don't have another term except for data governance. And there's a lot of data management that comes in there, but we're talking about science, engineering, product. How are we going to do this? How are we going to build those models? I have not even looked at how we actually do all that model building. To me, that's a programming task, and I did that years ago. I'm not going there. I'm just going to stay with the data. I'll tell you what I need. I'll tell you what the results should look like. You make it happen type of thing. But there's a lot of other roles that have to play in here. So if I take the Agile from that pure Scrum that says we're just going to have a team, yes, it was supposed to be cross-functional and was supposed to hit all those different areas. But if we don't know what we're working on, I'm not sure we know that we have everybody we need. By having all these extra resources with their own skills involved working together, we are able to move this across and not have it continue to be in that silo itself. Of course, this wouldn't be a PMI talk if I didn't talk about risk. PMI, it doesn't matter. The first time I taught the ACP, the Agile Certified Practitioner exam course, I had somebody that had been doing Agile for, she said, 6 years. We don't ever do risk. We don't talk about risk. I said, you're in a PMI exam. PMI always talks about risk. I mean, the amount of risk, the amount of uncertainty, not so much in the PMP, but in the CAPM course, the whole idea of uncertainty and risk is about a third of that exam because we're trying to look at where that uncertainty could come from. Now, the problem that happens in AI, it's not just the uncertainty of whether events are going to occur, but we go back and look at the data. We have bias in the data, and if we don't discover it, we don't see it. Think about if you were to send out surveys and questionnaires to get requirements for your project. First of all, what is the percentage that you're going to get back? Probably only 37%. And are your responses going to be biased? Most likely. Because who's going to respond are those people that are really happy or people who are really upset and nothing in between. And therefore, your data that you're going to get back off that survey or questionnaire is very biased. And what we have to realize in AI, if we're relying on this data, when we're trying to train the model, we have to make sure that all of those areas would be covered. And sometimes we have to augment the data. Sometimes we have to make up data that we may not have access to at the time to make sure that we can create a model that doesn't pull that bias in. But that's one of the things that happened. The data quality, you all know, you've had to work with it. Garbage in, garbage out. Part of what we have to realize is, where do we get data? I mean, I've always made the comment, if I need to know an employee's address, sure, there's 25, 30 files where that address is stored. Where is the one place where that address gets updated when they move? Probably whatever is tied to their payroll. That's the source of record. And that's part of what we have to do to get the data quality is get back to the source of record, understand the calculations that are being done, understand the timing, making sure that we're looking at 3 pieces of data in the same time period, not in different time. That integration that comes into it, that whole data engineer ETL, ELT, whatever you want to call it, trying to put all this data and massage it so it all works together. And then just the fact that I don't trust what it's going to tell me. I don't trust that it's giving me the right answer. That's an uncertainty we're going to have. But do we not have that uncertainty or that risk threshold, that risk appetite with everybody or anybody? The organization has a risk appetite. Certain stakeholders have a risk appetite. They are not going to feel comfortable until you could absolutely prove that this decision was made correctly. That's the transparency that we have to have there. But being able to have smaller chunks where we can know that this is what should happen and we can actually inspect it and make sure it has. The last thing that we have to really start to look at is the whole governance and the ethics. And this is not really come out as strong as I'm sure it will, because we have to have that transparency. We have to know where the data came from. We have to know how decisions have been made. We have to explain that. We have to have the accountability. We have to be able to audit how something was done. And we have to continually monitor to make sure that we're getting the right answers. The whole area of data governance now is just all of a sudden, I mean, it's funny because I was doing that years ago. I was responsible for data governance for General Dynamics with all the stuff that's going on with cruise missiles and everything else. I was responsible for the data governance that was being used, but nobody really cared that much. Do they now? Yes, absolutely. And that's where we have to look at it, expanding those. So basically, we've changed how we do things based on Agile. The iteration, the evidence-based learning, the collaboration, the continued focus on the value. What we have to look at is we change it a little bit because we have to now focus on the data aspect of it, the ethics, the governance, and the continual monitoring. Now, I'm going to give you just something a little different. Story on a board, tiny tasks in a world we couldn't yet afford. But every sprint sparked by a kind of mind, iterations turning years in the great design. In the futures in our hands, learning from the data as it's shifting in the sand. Back and beyond cold control, taking pathways no machine could ever fall. Changing code, the universe of inside and every episode. When sitting on one stories turning gold, everything is taking through just waiting for. No, I can tell her she fly, 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 fly.
In the future.
Okay. That actually was written with AI. We wrote the words, and then we used a website called suno.com and put the words into it and then chose the music. And we've done it for a lot of the songs that we do. Just that's kind of one of the fun things that we've chosen to do. It's kind of fun, little different as we go through and look at that. So let me see, because I know we've got a bunch of questions in the chat. So let me see. So Daryl, you said we taught them something we didn't know that we taught. Absolutely. And that's really when you stop to think about it. The whole agile mindset, the idea of communication, collaboration, transparency, prioritization, is that now kind of building itself into everything? Value delivery, as you go through. It's interesting. A lot of the decision makers you said don't have any idea of the meaning of what you just said. I agree. This terminology is for us. This is not the terminology that we use with our stakeholders, and especially with executives. We speak the language of the person we're working with. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times when I'm teaching the PMP, I say to people, progressive elaboration and rolling wave. That's a term you need to know for the exam, but don't ever use that when you're talking to your customer. My older daughter doesn't want to admit she's a project manager, but she had a big event and she was telling me that they sat down afterwards and had this discussion. And then she said, okay, Mom, so what's it called? I said, it's a retrospective. She said, good. I'll never use that term. But she did it. And that's the key. We need to speak the language of who we're working with. And when we're working with that, going through. Daryl, you also said Walmart's very tight with their data. Actually, I'll disagree a little bit because I worked with JP Stevens, who do the towels and sheets and everything. They don't have warehouses. I had to work with JP Stevens because they were getting electronic data every night as to what their sales were. And then the JP Stevens had to determine then, what are we going to ship next? They will tell you what the sales are, maybe not for everything, but for your products, they do. They tell you exactly what's sold, because if you don't hit a certain level, you're not going to be on a certain shelf. You're going to either be pushed up higher or lower. And they do this on a daily basis. So there's a lot of data shared, maybe not beyond, but if there's a goal and you're not meeting it, that goal had to have some other data in it. Thanks, John, for putting that 12 months in there. Systems analyst, data analyst, business analyst, data scientist, I don't care what you call it. That is a skill that we have to have. And that's went away because we got into analysis paralysis. It's starting to come back more and more. And actually in the CAPM, it's 28% of the CAPM exam. Not on the PMP, but it's on the CAPM. So they are teaching entry-level project managers that you need to have those capabilities of being able to analyze what's going there as you go. So Nick, you said the movie, the Robots of Will Smith. I haven't seen it, but I know my husband has. He does a lot more. How far do I think we're away from that? Not very far in some cases. Do you know when they talk about the autonomous pattern of AI, which has to do with these self-driving cars? Most cars right now are at a autonomous level 3. You have those things on your mirrors that say you have somebody on the side. If somebody drives behind you as you're trying to pull out of a parking lot, your steering wheel shimmies, etc. If it actually can stop, which it does, if it thinks you're going to run into the car in front of it, it'll screech to a stop. That's a level 3 of an autonomous car. And almost every car that's manufactured today is at an autonomous level 3. Level 4 is where you have to teach it what to do without you being there to help it out. Level 5 would be truly autonomous, where it knows what to do all the time. We're getting there because one of the other patterns of AI is where you kind of do that exploratory and you let, like a mouse figure out how to go through a maze, and how you teach, if it hits this, what do you do? So the more that we learn, the more we experiment, the closer we are to that. But Troy, you're asking about the certification. I would look at the CPMAI. It is actually, if you're looking at from a project management standpoint, it's really good. If you're looking more at how you do it, the original CPMAI was more technical. It was a 35-hour thing, and it was tough. I got that certification first, and then I transferred and got the PMI one. But PMI is more on how do you manage, because it talks about the different stages when you're doing an AI project, which, once again, if you know Agile, it's easy to be able to visualize what they're talking about. But yes, does anybody else have that CPMAI? Take a look. There's actually a 1-hour overview out on PMI.org that's free. I would take a look at it. Excellent, excellent. The other thing is, how many of you have actually seen the new AI practice guide? Or are you aware that PMI just put out a new practice guide for AI? It's excellent. I know they're updating the Agile one right now, but they actually put out an AI practice guide that, once again, as a member of PMI, you can download that. So there's so much coming. And, from our standpoint, the more that we understand, especially the governance aspect, would really help when we look at that, the ethics. And that's, once again, the different patterns of AI, the governance that has to be on it, and then the ethics itself. If you aren't connected with me on LinkedIn, I encourage you to connect with me and subscribe to my newsletter, because actually my newsletter that's going out tomorrow morning is on this topic specifically. But I've done one on the patterns of AI. I've done one on the governance of AI. I've done one on the ethics of AI. So I tend to do more kind of taking a subject and writing it as part of a newsletter. You can just write more. But you also then, you're notified if you subscribe to my newsletter, when I put a new one out, it'll, LinkedIn will actually notify you that there's a new one and what the topic is. So, but yeah.
So, Greta, we're at the top of the hour. I'd like to thank you very much. This was a very interesting presentation. And that song at the end was pretty cool. I love the lyrics, actually, because like I'm dealing with a lot of teams that are kind of losing they're just kind of giving up, you know what I mean? They think AI is going to take over the world, but you've given us some definite good insights. So thank you.
You're welcome. Glad I could be part of it.